Hi, my name is Jan, and in this tutorial I want to show you how to connect multiple databases with Mendix without the use of API. So if you find yourself in a situation in which you need to connect multiple databases and there are no APIs for connecting with your external data source, then this tutorial is just for you. Mendix offers out of the box the most used database connections that are available worldwide. As you can see, my project has the Postgres database connected to it, which is my default, but I want to have an additional MySQL database. Mendix offers that right out of the box on MySQL, but since I really need my Postgres database as being my default, I need to have an additional way to connect a additional database to my project. So the first thing we have to do is we're going to create a separated module in which we will build our integration with the external MySQL database. The next thing that we're going to do is we have to build a resource folder, which will contain all the connection details and credentials that we need in order to connect to our external MySQL database. What we need for the connection is the host URL or IP of the server you're referring to and when your MySQL database environment is hosted. We need a port number, we need the database name, the username and the password. Once we all have this set up, it's time to check the external MySQL database and see what it is that we can retrieve from the database. So for this tutorial we are going to use my Plesk hosting platform, which is where my database is hosted. And please understand that this is a dedicated server which allows me to set up external access to my database server since I have my own dedicated IP address. So when it comes to the database, as you can see, it belongs to greendirection.nl. It's an old domain I still used to have, but the database are still working for it. And when we get into our database, what we see here is we have a user table containing two records with the name Carol and Dania, which are the person that we're going to retrieve into our Mendix application. So back in Studio Pro, we are going to create a microflow that is going to retrieve the users from the external MySQL database. We give it the name connect with external database, and then first thing we're going to do when we created this database is we're going to look for the execute query, which is the main activity for running the connection, taking care of the results and also of the retrieved data itself. As you can see, once we drop the execute query activity, several errors occur which are all related to the missing connection or credentials. So let's first work on the JDBC connection here at the top, which is a string that we want to construct in a separated string variable, and we are going to call this the JDBC connection. The connection that we need to construct here will always start with the type of engine, which in this case is MySQL. Then we give it the IP of the URL of the server where it needs to find the direct port, which is the next variable is the database port, and we end it with the flash forward, which gives us the name of the database. So this basically tells the JDBC connector on which server and through which port do I need to go in order to find the given database name. And now that we have set up the JDBC connection, we need to create a result object. In our case, that means we need an entity with the exact same attributes as our user table in the external MySQL database. And this brings us back to the domain model of our database integration module, and we're going to create a new entity that we call external user. We must fill out, like I said before, the exact same attribute name as the MySQL query database. Once we're done, we create an external user object in our microflow, which we are using as a parameter in the execute query. Besides that, the execute query returns a list of the external user object that contains the data from the external MySQL database. And now let's fill out the rest of the parameters for the JDBC connector. We are going to use the constants that we created at the beginning of this tutorial, and we are going to fill them out at the corresponding parameters for the connection. When it comes to the SQL, we start out with a very simple select statement, which means like select name, email and phone from users. Once we've done that, we're basically done here and we can move on. I am sorry I forgot the JDBC connection string itself, which would be a great game stopper because there will basically no data be retrieved. Okay, well, have that said, and of course we want to see some feedback on the screen. So we add a message activity that will show us the name of the first user from the MySQL user table. And at least a very important habit, it's always put custom error handling on external integration. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put some external integration here to make sure that if something goes wrong, we know in detail what it is that went wrong. So this brings us to the end of this microflow. I think we're all set, so let's retrieve some users from the external database. And as we can see, we see Caro as the first of the list of users that we retrieve from our MySQL database, which tells us that we have a successful JDBC connection with an external database and we retrieved data over SQL. So now that we've seen the successful retrieve of users from the external MySQL database, let's see how we can write back to the SQL database. What we're going to do first is we are going to create a simple form, just the name, email and the phone number. We put a little microflow behind it, so there's a button that triggers a microflow. So let's go through this microflow in more detail. This microflow starts with creating the insert result. This is because MySQL always returns an inserted ID. So we need to store it or at least receive it from the server. The second activity is the SQL statement. This differs quite from the retrieves. And if you're interested in more details into SQL and all the options that are according to writing and receiving through SQL, check the links below in the video description. The JDBC connection is the same as we are familiar with from the retrieve flow, and so are the execute error handling and the client response. We went through this in detail in the retrieve flow. So there is nothing left to discuss at this point, so let's add some users in our MySQL database. And as we can see, Joe has been added to the database, which tells us that also the insert from our Mendix application into an external databases using SQL was successful. So this brings us to the end of this tutorial, in which we discovered together how to set up a JDBC connector in order to write and retrieve data from an external database server into your Mendix application. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have some comments or feedback that will help us improve this video, please write them down in the comments. Thank you for watching and keep learning.